Part 2 on lecture 7. So we are going to represent external economies of scale by assuming that the larger the industry, the lower the industry average cost. So there's going to be a downward sloping average cost. The larger the industry output, the lower the price at which firms might sell and break even. So in this picture, we depict market equilibrium in the presence of external economies of scale. So the blue line is demand, so of the output, which is, we are going to call it widgets, and the red line is the decreasing average cost. So output quantity is measured on the horizontal axis, price and cost on the vertical axis. So again, with external economies of scale, the average cost is decreasing. Given competition among producers, so like we are thinking here of industry with many large firms competing. So the market equilibrium is going to be at the point where average cost curve intersect the demand curve. So the idea here is that firms compete away all the profits, and so price is going to end up being equal to average cost. And so market equilibrium is at the point 1 where the downward sloping average cost curve AC intersect the demand curve D. And so the equilibrium output is Q1, and the equilibrium price is P1. So prior to international trade, equilibrium, so in other words, in autarky, there was no trade, equilibrium prices and output for each country would be at the point where the domestic average cost curve intersects the domestic demand curve. So suppose, for example, that Chinese bottom prices in the absence of trade will be lower than the US bottom prices. So this is represented in this picture. So in the left panel, we have average cost and demand for China. The price is P China. In the right panel, we have production and consumption and price in the US. And so in this picture shows that before opening up trade, price is lower in China than in the US, reflecting a lower average cost. So, okay, so what does that tell us? Well, suppose we then decide to open up trade. So what's going to happen? Well, because they're able to sell at a lower price, the Chinese bottom industry will expand and the US bottom industry will contract, and the process will feed itself as US consumers buy more and more lower price bottoms in China. China is going to be able to exploit external economies of scale and produce even more at an even lower price. And so Chinese industry output rises, costs continue falling, US industry output shrinks, costs go up. So in the end, there is concentration of all bottom production in China. So how this is the important novelty relative to previous model. So that is to say, let's ask ourselves, what is the implication of free trade on prices? So So Chinese bottom prices in this example were lower than US bottom prices before trade, but because China's average cost is downward sloping, increased production as a result of trade leads to a bottom price that is even lower than the price before trade. So trade leads to the prices that are lower than the prices in either country before trade. So this is an important difference with the models that we have studied so far. So let me emphasize this. Trade with external economies reduces prices. We are thinking in this example the price of buttons. You can think about the price of buttons relative to other prices. Trade decreases this relative price. Now remember what happened in the standard trade models. In the standard trade model, relative prices converge as a result of trade. So if, let's say, clothes or buttons, were relatively cheap in the home country and relatively expensive in the foreign country before trade opens, the effect of trade was to raise the cloth or bottom prices in home and reduce them in foreign. So the relative price in the standard trade model after opening up trade or free trade converges to somewhere in the middle, the original relative prices in the two countries. With external economies, the effect of trade is to reduce prices everywhere. So the world price ends up being lower than it was in both countries as a result of opening up trade in an industry which has external economies of scale. So in particular, now, this can be stressed again in this picture, right? So in this picture, we have added to the quantity demanded by China, the quantity demanded in the US, and so we have generated, going right towards the demand for button in the world. And it's pretty clear that now that after China has become the only sort of world producer, the equilibrium price is determined by the intersection of world demand and the average cost in China. And so the new equilibrium is a larger quantity, Q2, and the lower price, P2, relative to the autarky regime in which the quantity of production in China was Q1 and the price P1. So opening up trade it leads China to producing buttons for the world market, which consists of its own market and the US market. Output rises and price falls. And it falls, the price is lower than the price of buttons in either country before that. So I mean, sort of repeat that because that is, the main lessons and the fundamental difference between the models we have studied previously. So what may cause one country to have an initial advantage from having a lower price? So of course there could be reason due to comparative advantage, different technologies, different resources, but it could also be that external economies are due to historical accidents. So that means that in such a case, the pattern of trade, as opposed to being determined by some comparative advantage, is determined by historical accident. What do I mean by that? I mean it could be that the countries get a head start. So if you start as a large producer in a certain industry, there might be a tendency to remain a large producer, even if another country could potentially produce more cheaply. But you know, you could potentially produce more cheaply, but if you have to sort of catch up in production, it might just not be possible to do so. So, for example, you know, there are many examples of industry that have got, you know, high concentration in certain areas can be traced back to some initial historical fact, which is in some way accidental. So, for example, Silicon Valley, you know, might always existence to the fact that, you know, Hewlett and Packard, you know, started a business in a garage there. These were two Stanford graduates, and that business, you know, generated additional sort of effects, and so was the starting point of Silicon Valley. So you could imagine that, you know, rather than two graduate students from Stanford, if two, you know, graduate students from MIT had done it in Massachusetts, you know, maybe Silicon Valley would be located, you know, somewhere near Boston. Similarly, you know, there are lots of examples. For example, this tufted blanket, you know, that, you know, created, you know, as a wedding gift by a 19th century teenager, gave rise to the cluster of carpet manufacturers around Dalton in Georgia. And there are many examples worldwide of similar historical accidents. So to see how having a head start might generate inefficiency, let's consider the following example. So suppose that you know, the Vietnamese average cost curve lies below the Chinese curve, because they say what Vietnamese wages are lower than Chinese wages. So at any given level of production, Vietnam could manufacture buttons more cheaply than China. So one might hope that this would always imply that Vietnam will in fact supply the world market. But the point is, this might not be the case if China has enough of a head start. And so one implication here is this sort of no guarantee that the right country will produce a good that is subject to external economies of scale. So that kind of a discussion can be made a little bit more precise with the help of this picture. So again, this is the picture of quantity of balance and price of balance. Think about the blue downward sloping demand function as being the demand for the world. And now let's work with sort of our assumption of China having a higher average cost. So the average cost of China is sort of the orangey curve, and the average cost of Vietnam is this lower red cost curve. So to fix ideas and to make the example stark, imagine that China has a head start, and Vietnam is not there. So Vietnam has not established its industry yet, and so as a result, the world equilibrium is one where China is the producer. We are at point 1. The quantity produced is Q1, and the price is P1. Now, if you could establish Vietnam industry, you know, sort of instantly, you could see how in Vietnam could be producing the same quantity at a lower price, and equilibrium would end up really being a point 2, where Vietnam is the only producer of bonds. The quantity as supplied is higher, and the price is lower. But imagine on the other hand, that establishing a new industry sort of takes time, and you sort of had to start initially by selling as sort of, you had to start with firms entering the industry, and they're not all entering at the same time. A few of them start entering, and then see what happens. So imagine then that sort of only a small number of firms enter, so that they are only able to produce a small amount. So notice how at the very beginning, when the industry is small, the unit cost is C0. So the unit cost of the industry when starting up is actually higher than the current world market price. So basically, whenever there are no other firms, and so there is no, so the industry is not yet in a position to exploit their economies of scale. Firms entering will be producing as CO, but as CO they will not be able to compete with the Chinese industry, so they will never enter. And so the story is well, the firms will never enter, because if they enter, they will be able to produce a C0, and they will not make any profit. And so the pattern of specialization, which was established by historical accident, might persist even when new producer could potentially have lower costs. Okay, so let's again stop here to make this file small and manageable.